In this set of lectures, we're going to talk about how we're going to go about operationalizing our variables, essentially how we're going to go about measuring the variables that we want to include in our research projects. And in particular, we're going to cover what you need to know in order to develop good research questions or how to select appropriate measures for your variables. So the first thing we're going to talk about is psychometric properties. And psychometric properties is an assessment of the extent to which an assessment method is appropriate for measuring the variable of interest. So, for example, if you are interested in measuring racism, for example, you're going to want to know that the measure that you're using is appropriate for that. In other words, does research support its use as a measure of that particular trait? And there are two metrics used in determining the psychometric properties of measures, and these are validity and reliability, which we'll talk about both separately and then jointly. So we're going to start with validity, and validity is an assessment of the extent to which a test measures what it's intended to measure. Okay. One of the things to remember about validity is that it is not inherent in a test. So a test isn't inherently valid or invalid, but rather it's relative to the purpose of the test. So for example, if you were trying to hire someone to teach classes on orienteering, you probably wouldn't want to use a written test of orienteering knowledge because that's going to assess both kind of what the person knows about orienteering, but also their writing ability. And writing ability may have nothing to do with their ability to teach a class on orienteering. So we would say that that test is relatively low on validity, or maybe has moderate validity. However, if you were to have the person give a lecture or kind of lead a class on orienteering and use that as a method of assessing their ability, that would be said to have high validity because essentially it is demonstrating or testing exactly what you're interested in knowing, which is the degree to which this person can in fact teach orienteering skills. Now, obviously there's going to be things that are going to introduce error in measurement that will reduce some of the validity, right? So if they're fatigued, if they're nervous, these are things that are kind of transient states that might introduce error into the measurement. However, the evaluators may have different ideas about what should get covered in a course, right? So these are all things that might sort of result in some lowering in the degree of validity for that test, but overall, because it is directly measuring what it's intended to measure, it would be considered a more highly valid test. And that's the other thing about validity, is that it is measured in terms of degree, which varies along a continuum rather than being a yes or no thing. So a test could be considered highly valid or minimally valid. And so in this case, what we would say is that research would either support or would not support the validity of a given test. So there are two broad categories, actually three broad categories of validity, and then some subcategories within each one. The first is judgmental validity, which is kind of a subjective measure of validity, which is determined by the researcher, right? So it's the researcher's opinion about the validity of the test. And the first type is content validity, which asks the question, does the test or measure cover the relevant content? Does it give appropriate weight to different aspects of the trait? So for example, with intelligence as an example, intelligence is not a single concept, but construct or trait, but rather is made up of a bunch of different traits. And so we want to be sure that if we're measuring intelligence, that we are measuring all aspects of intelligence. But who determines that? Well, it's determined by the researcher. So I would define what I mean by a particular trait, and then I would construct a measure that covers that content, and of course gives more weight to those parts of the trait that are more important or more central, and then less weight to other aspects of the trait that may be less central to it. Face validity is another form of judgmental validity, which asks the question, does the measure appear to test the trait it's intended to test or measure? In other words, can I guess what the measure is getting at by simply reading the questions? Okay. So face validity and content validity are not necessarily correlated with one another. They may seem to be, but they're not. Just because a measure is face valid doesn't mean that it has content validity. So for example, I could ask you, on a scale of 1 very weak to 10 very strong, how strong is your self-esteem? So this is a pretty face valid measure in the sense that you know exactly what I'm getting at, but it probably doesn't get at all of the components or aspects of self-esteem. So it wouldn't necessarily cover the relevant content. So while it may have high face validity, it may be lacking in content validity. Okay. All right. The other type of validity, which is more objective, is empirical validity, and it's objective because it's assessed using data. And in particular, empirical validity involves the use of a criterion, and a criterion is a gold standard of the trait that you want to investigate. In criterion-related validity, the goal is to determine whether the current measure is either measuring the same thing as the gold standard or whether it's predictive of some intended outcome, which would also serve as a criterion. So in predictive validity, the criterion is some relevant outcome that you are trying to predict. And so the criterion is something that happens after the measure is administered. So they're administered at 2 different points in time. So the predictor is administered at one point and the criterion is measured at another point in time. And it asks the question, to what extent does the current test predict the outcome it's intended to measure? So for example, we've talked about this before, to what extent do SAT scores, the predictor, predict freshman year GPA, which would be considered the criterion, right? So this is an outcome it's intended to predict. In concurrent validity, on the other hand, this involves administering the test and the gold standard measure at the same time. And it asks the question, to what extent is the new measure correlated with or measuring the same thing as the gold standard? So in this case, the criterion would be the gold standard test, and the new measure would be the one that we're looking at in relationship to the gold standard. So for example, we might say, I'm interested in developing a new measure of social anxiety disorder, and I wanted to assess its concurrent validity, so I will administer the test, and at the same time I will have a psychiatrist who will interview the patient using DSM-5 criteria, and then I will compare the degree to which the psychiatrist and the measure agree on the extent to which the person meets the criteria for social anxiety disorder. And that if they do, then it would be said to have that it would be said that the evidence supports the concurrent validity of the test. So in order to assess criterion-related validity, researchers have to collect data on the measure they've developed and the gold standard or the relevant outcome, and then calculate a correlation coefficient. And this coefficient is referred to as the criterion-related validity coefficient, either for predictive or concurrent validity. It has a value that ranges from 0 to 1, with 1 meaning perfect overlap, which we never get, right, because of error in measurement, and 0 meaning no overlap. And in order for us to say that that research suggests that this measure has adequate validity, we would expect to see a criterion-related validity coefficient of 0.8 or greater. Okay, the third type of validity is judgmental empirical. So this is a type of validity that involves both subjective and objective components. And it's typically, it is associated with construct validity. So we need to start with understanding what a construct is, right? A construct is a special trait, a special type of trait that cannot be directly measured. Rather, it's a trait that is represented by multiple indicators or other traits that can be observed directly or measured. So for example, intelligence would be considered a construct because it isn't something that we can directly measure, but rather we estimate it through administering measures of individual traits that can be directly observed. So for example, I give you an example here for intelligence. Intelligence could be made up of, it's made up of more than this, but short-term memory, basic knowledge, spatial ability, abstract reasoning ability, and problem solving, right? So each of these things can be measured directly, and then they're used to estimate the individual's overall intelligence. And so intelligence itself would be a construct, and the indicators of the construct would be each one of these individual traits that can be directly observed or measured. There are two different types of construct validity, convergent and discriminant. And as their name implies, in convergent validity, the question is to what extent does the measure converge on or measure the same thing as some other measure or gold standard. And in discriminant validity, the question is the degree to which this measure discriminates between this construct and another related construct. Okay, so in the process of establishing construct validity then, we would identify those constructs that we would expect to be correlated with the construct that we're interested in, and we would also identify constructs that we would expect it to not be correlated with, right? So for example, if our measure of intelligence predicts academic success, then we would, and if that's something that we thought should be correlated with intelligence, then the measure would be said to have convergent validity. If it doesn't predict annual household income, and we expect that it shouldn't predict that, then it would be said to have discriminant validity, right? In other words, the measure of the construct converges on or correlates with similar other measures of the construct and traits that are expected to be related to it, but it can be discriminated from unrelated construct or traits. Another example that might be easier to kind of wrap your head around would be something like a measure that measures depression. So we would want to see convergent validity to the extent that our current measure of depression correlates highly with other measures of depression or other indicators of depression like lethargy, for example. And discriminant validity would be demonstrated if we could show that the measure of depression was unrelated to a measure of anxiety. In other words, the test assesses traits related to depression and it distinguishes depression from anxiety. All right, so that's the distinction. And in general, when we think about adequate levels, then we're talking about a level of 0.8. And again, this involves correlation coefficients. And I should mention that the judgmental aspect is it is the researcher who determines what the indicators are that make up the trait, right? So I would define intelligence, and in defining it, I would determine what are the individual traits or indicators that make up intelligence. That is a subjective process, and then I would test that using data. And then the correlations that we can produce between the indicators and the test would establish either its convergent or discriminant validity. All right, so I'm going to end the lecture here because the next part of this lecture is going to focus on reliability.